The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of earth hitting wood. I stood beside my husband's grave, watching the last handful of dirt cover the mahogany casket we'd chosen together just 3 days earlier. My fingers traced the simple gold band on my ring finger. 42 years of marriage reduced to this moment, this silence, this final goodbye to the only man who'd ever truly seen me. The funeral director approached with practiced sympathy, his voice soft but efficient. "Mrs. Henderson, if you need anything." "Thank you," I whispered, my throat raw from 3 days of tears I'd tried to keep private. "I think I just need a moment." The mourners were dispersing slowly. Neighbors, a few distant cousins, my daughter-in-law Sarah with her perpetually distracted expression, and Michael, my son, standing apart from everyone else, checking his phone with the same detached efficiency he brought to everything in his life. I should have felt grateful that he'd come at all. Our relationship had been cooling for years, each conversation shorter than the last, each visit feeling more obligatory than loving. But Robert, my husband, had always believed Michael would come around. "He's just focused on his career," Robert would say whenever I mentioned feeling like a stranger to our own son. "Success takes time. He'll remember what family means." Robert had been wrong about many things in his life, but never about people, until now. My brother-in-law James approached as I stood there, lost in memories of better times. James had always been the gentler of the two brothers, the one who remembered birthdays and asked about my garden. His wife Linda stood beside him, her eyes red from crying. She'd loved Robert like her own brother. "Margaret," James said softly, pulling me into a hug that smelled of aftershave and grief. "He was so proud of you. Every time we talked, he'd mention something you'd done, your volunteer work at the hospital, the way you handled his mother's passing, how you kept the house running when his business struggled." I nodded, unable to speak. Robert had seen value in the small things I did, the daily acts of love that Michael seemed to view as ordinary, expected, invisible. James pulled back slightly, his hands still on my shoulders. "Listen, I need to tell you something." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "About Michael." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "What about Michael?" James glanced over at his nephew, who was now walking toward his BMW, still absorbed in whatever urgent business demanded his attention even here, even now. "During the service," James said carefully, when the pastor was speaking about Robert's devotion to family, he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "James, please, what is it?" Michael was smiling. The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly might somehow make them less devastating. Not the kind of smile people wear when they're remembering happy times. Something colder, and he was texting. During the eulogy, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. I looked toward the parking area where Michael stood beside his car, apparently in an animated conversation on his phone. His body language was relaxed, almost casual, not the posture of a man who'd just buried his father. "Maybe I misunderstood," James continued, but his eyes told a different story. "Maybe grief affects people differently, but Linda saw it too, and she mentioned that yesterday, when you were meeting with the funeral director, Michael was asking very specific questions about the will." My breath caught. "What kind of questions?" "About the house, about Robert's life insurance policy, about how quickly estates typically get settled." James squeezed my hands gently. "Margaret, I've known that boy since he was born. I've watched him grow into a successful man. But what I saw these past few days, it wasn't grief, it was calculation." If you like emotional stories that touch the heart, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here who appreciate real, honest storytelling. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know where these stories find their way to you. The drive home from the cemetery was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every red light gave me more time to replay James's words, to examine every interaction I'd had with Michael over the past 3 days. The quick hug he'd given me when he arrived from Chicago, the way he'd barely looked at his father's body during the viewing, the phone call I'd overheard him making to someone about getting this sorted out quickly. Our house sat on Maple Street like it had for the past 30 years, its blue shutters and flower boxes unchanged despite everything that had happened inside these walls. Robert had painted those shutters last spring, climbing the ladder despite my protests about his 70-year-old knees. "A man takes care of his home," he'd said, laughing at my worry. "It's a reflection of the life he's built." Now the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. I walked through rooms where Robert's presence still lingered, his reading glasses on the kitchen table, his coffee mug in the sink, the mystery novel he'd never finished lying open on his nightstand. But something else lingered too, the echo of James's warning and the growing realization that perhaps I'd been naive about more than I wanted to admit. The phone rang as I sat in Robert's chair, still wearing my black dress, still trying to process a grief that now carried the weight of suspicion. Michael's voice came through the speaker with a brightness that seemed inappropriate for the circumstances. "Mom, I hope you're holding up okay. I know today was hard. Thank you for being there," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Your father would have been glad to see you." There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Listen, I've been thinking. It might be good for you to start considering your options. This house is pretty big for one person, and with Dad's medical bills over the past year, we managed fine," I said quickly. "The insurance covered most of it." "I'm sure it did, but still, maintaining a place this size, all alone, maybe it's time to think about something smaller, something more manageable." His tone was gentle, reasonable, the same voice he'd used as a child when trying to convince me to let him stay up past bedtime. "Michael, your father just died this afternoon." "I know, Mom, I know. But Dad would want us to be practical about things. He wouldn't want you struggling with upkeep and expenses you don't need." As he spoke, I found myself walking to the window that overlooked the garden Robert and I had planted together. Roses he'd chosen for their color, vegetables I'd selected for our table, a small bench where we'd sat countless evenings planning our retirement dreams. Dreams that now belonged only to me. "We can talk about all this later," I said finally. Of course. I just want you to know that I'm here to help you through whatever comes next. We'll figure it all out together." But as I hung up the phone and looked around the home Robert and I had built with 42 years of shared effort, I wondered if Michael's idea of together meant the same thing as mine. The evening shadows grew longer across the hardwood floors, and somewhere in the growing darkness, I began to understand that grief might not be the only challenge I was facing. Something was beginning that I didn't yet fully comprehend, but James's words echoed in my memory. It wasn't grief I'd seen in my son's eyes. It was calculation. And for the first time since Robert's death, I felt not just sadness, but something that resembled fear. The next morning brought the kind of silence that only exists in a house where someone has died. I made coffee for one instead of two, set the table for one instead of two, and tried to find purpose in a day that stretched ahead without the gentle rhythm Robert and I had perfected over 4 decades together. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Through the peephole, I could see Michael standing on the front porch, dressed in his usual navy business suit, briefcase in hand as if this were a client meeting rather than a visit to his grieving mother. "Good morning, Mom," he said when I opened the door, giving me the same perfunctory hug he'd offered yesterday. "I brought some paperwork we need to go through. I thought it would be better to handle everything while I'm still in town." "Paperwork?" I stepped aside to let him in, noticing how his eyes immediately began cataloging the living room, the antique clock Robert had inherited from his grandfather, the china cabinet filled with our wedding crystal, the oil painting we'd bought during our anniversary trip to Maine. Estate stuff, Dad's will, insurance policies, the usual. Michael set his briefcase on the dining room table with the authority of someone taking charge. "I know it seems early, but there are time-sensitive issues we need to address." I poured him coffee in Robert's favorite mug without thinking, then immediately regretted the choice when Michael barely acknowledged the gesture. "Time-sensitive how?" "Well, for one thing, the life insurance company requires notification within 30 days, and there are tax implications we'll need to consider for next year's filing." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "I've already spoken to Dad's insurance agent and his accountant. They're both standing by to help us through the process." The casual efficiency in his voice made something cold settle in my chest. "You've already spoken to them." "Yesterday, after the funeral, I figured there was no point in delaying the inevitable." Michael spread papers across the table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, turning our dining room into a makeshift office. "The sooner we get everything organized, the sooner you can start planning your next steps." There was that phrase again, next steps. As if Robert's death had simply created a logistical problem that needed solving rather than a profound loss that required time to process and heal. "Michael, I'm not ready to think about next steps. I just buried your father yesterday." He looked up from the papers with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the patient tolerance he'd shown when I failed to understand something he considered obvious. I understand, Mom, but feelings don't stop bureaucracy from moving forward. These forms have deadlines whether we're ready or not. The way he said feelings, with just enough emphasis to make the word sound like an inconvenience, reminded me of conversations Robert and I had worried about over the years. When had our son learned to speak about emotions as if they were obstacles to overcome rather than natural human responses to loss? Let's start with the insurance, Michael continued, pulling out a document that looked official and intimidating. Dad's policy is worth $350,000. The beneficiary is listed as you, with me as secondary. Pretty standard setup. $350,000. I knew about the policy, of course, but hearing the number spoken aloud in Michael's matter-of-fact tone made it feel less like financial security and more like something else entirely. Something that had transformed Robert's death from a personal tragedy into a business transaction. That money represents 40 years of your father's premiums, I said quietly. 40 years of him wanting to make sure I'd be taken care of if something happened to him. Right. And now we need to make sure it's invested properly so it can take care of you for as long as possible. Michael clicked his pen and began writing notes on a legal pad. I've been researching retirement communities in the area. There are some really nice places where you could have your own apartment but access to medical care if you need it. Retirement communities. The phrase hit me like cold water. Michael, I'm 68 years old, not 98, and I'm perfectly capable of living in my own home. For now, sure, but this house is a lot of work, and it's not getting any easier. He gestured around the dining room as if the crown molding and hardwood floors were evidence of some kind of failure on my part. When's the last time you cleaned the gutters or had the furnace serviced? Dad took care of all that stuff. I can learn, or I can hire someone, which costs money. Money that could be put to better use if you weren't carrying the overhead of a 4-bedroom house. Michael's voice remained reasonable, logical, the tone of someone explaining simple mathematics to a child. Look, I'm not saying you have to decide today. I'm just suggesting we explore options while we're handling all the other estate business. But the way he said estate business made it clear that in his mind, Robert's death had already been reduced to a series of administrative tasks that needed to be completed efficiently and without unnecessary sentiment. I watched him organize documents with the same methodical precision he'd probably use for any other business deal, and I wondered when my son had learned to view his family as just another portfolio to be managed. The phone rang, interrupting my growing unease. The caller ID showed my neighbor Ellen's number. "Oh, Margaret, honey." Ellen's voice was warm with sympathy when I answered. "I've been thinking about you all morning. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I said, aware of Michael's attention shifting to my conversation even as he continued working through his papers. "I was wondering if you'd like some company today. I made way too much soup last night, and I thought maybe we could sit on the porch and talk. Sometimes it helps to have someone listen when you're processing everything." The offer of simple human companionship made my throat tight with gratitude. Ellen understood what I needed. Not efficiency or solutions, but presence and patience. "That sounds wonderful. Would this afternoon work?" "Perfect. I'll see you around 2. When I hung up, Michael was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ellen Morrison from next door?" "Ellen Patterson. She's been our neighbor for 15 years. I wondered why he'd gotten her name wrong, but then realized it had been at least 3 years since Michael had visited long enough to have a real conversation with any of our friends. "Nice lady," he said, but his tone suggested he'd already dismissed her importance. "You know, when you do decide to downsize, you'll probably find it harder to maintain those kinds of friendships. Retirement communities actually make it easier to meet people your own age who share similar interests." The casual way he spoke about dismantling my entire social world, as if 40 years of neighborhood relationships were just another inconvenience to be managed, made me understand something I'd been avoiding. Michael wasn't just thinking practically about my future. He was actively planning to reshape my life according to his own vision of what would be most convenient for everyone involved. "I'm not ready to think about leaving this house," I said firmly. "This is where your father and I built our life together. Every room has memories I'm not prepared to abandon. Memories are portable, Mom. You can take photos anywhere." Michael returned to his paperwork as if the conversation were settled. "Besides, staying attached to material things isn't healthy. Dad wouldn't want you to become a prisoner to a house. The dismissive way he characterized my attachment to our home, as if 40 years of shared history could be reduced to unhealthy sentimentality, revealed something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of grief. When had my son learned to speak about love as if it were a weakness to overcome, rather than a strength to honor? "I think that's enough for today," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need time to process everything that's happened before I can think clearly about anything else." Michael glanced at his watch, an expensive piece that caught the light from our dining room chandelier. "I've got a flight back to Chicago tomorrow afternoon. It would really help if we could at least get the insurance paperwork submitted before I leave." "The insurance paperwork can wait until next week. Mom, the longer we delay—" "Michael," I used the tone that had stopped him in his tracks when he was 7 years old and testing boundaries. "I said it can wait." He stared at me for a moment, and in his expression, I saw something that chilled me more than anything James had told me yesterday. It wasn't frustration or even impatience. It was calculation, the look of someone reassessing a situation that wasn't proceeding according to plan. "Of course," he said finally, beginning to gather his papers with movements that seemed just a little too controlled. "I'm sorry if I'm pushing too hard. Grief affects everyone differently, and I tend to cope by staying busy." But as he packed his briefcase, I noticed he palmed one of the documents, something he'd apparently decided I didn't need to see after all. And when he kissed my cheek goodbye, his embrace felt like the kind of gesture someone performs when they're being watched, rather than an expression of genuine affection. After he left, I sat in the dining room surrounded by the phantom presence of all those papers, trying to understand what had just happened. My son had visited his grieving mother and spent an hour treating her like a client whose assets needed repositioning. And somewhere in the space between his words and his actions, I'd begun to realize that James might have been more right than either of us wanted to believe. The afternoon stretched ahead like a question I wasn't ready to answer, but Ellen would be here soon with soup and sympathy, and maybe together we could make sense of a world that had suddenly become much more complicated than simple grief. Ellen arrived that afternoon carrying a pot of homemade chicken soup, and the kind of gentle presence that only comes from decades of friendship. We sat on the front porch swing Robert had installed the summer we moved in, watching the neighborhood children ride their bikes while the late afternoon sun painted everything golden. "You know what I remember most about Robert?" Ellen said, ladling soup into the bowls I'd brought outside. "The way he used to shovel my driveway every winter without being asked. Never wanted credit for it, never mentioned it, just quietly took care of people. The soup was perfect. Rich and comforting, seasoned with the kind of love that can't be bought in stores. He said helping neighbors was just what people did, like holding doors or saying please and thank you. That's where Michael gets his good heart," Ellen said, and I felt my chest tighten at the innocent assumption. Robert always spoke so proudly of his success in Chicago, said he'd raised a son who knew how to take care of business. I stirred my soup slowly, wondering how to respond. How do you tell a dear friend that the son everyone assumes inherited his father's values might have learned something entirely different? Michael is very focused on practical matters. Must be such a comfort having him handle all the difficult decisions right now. I remember when my Harold passed, I could barely think straight for months. Having someone capable to lean on makes all the difference. Ellen meant well, but her words highlighted the growing gap between what people expected to see and what I was actually experiencing. Everyone assumed Michael's efficiency was a gift, that his business-like approach to my grief was exactly what an overwhelmed widow needed. But sitting there with Ellen's homemade soup warming my hands, I realized what I actually needed was someone who understood that love couldn't be organized into manila folders or optimized for tax purposes. The next morning, I decided to drive to Chicago. The idea had come to me during the sleepless hours before dawn. Maybe Michael's coldness was just his way of coping with loss. Maybe seeing him in his own environment, away from the pressure of managing his father's affairs, would remind us both of who we used to be to each other. I called his office around 10, after the morning rush hour would have settled. His secretary, a pleasant young woman named Jessica, put me through immediately. "Mom, is everything okay?" The concern in his voice felt genuine, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope. "Everything's fine. I was thinking I might drive up this afternoon. Maybe take you to dinner? It's been so long since we've had time to really talk." There was a pause, the kind of silence that stretches just long enough to feel deliberate. "Today's pretty crazy, actually. We're in the middle of a major acquisition, and I've got client meetings until late. What about tomorrow?" I could stay overnight at that little hotel near your apartment. Tomorrow's not great either. Listen, Mom, this probably isn't the best time for a social visit. I'm still catching up from the days I missed for Dad's funeral. The phrase social visit hung in the air between us, as if a grieving mother wanting to spend time with her only child was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a connection to be cherished. I understand you're busy. I just thought, how about this? I'll try to get down there next month. We can go through more of Dad's paperwork then. Maybe finish getting everything organized. Dad's paperwork. Even when discussing the possibility of spending time together, Michael could only frame it in terms of the administrative tasks that seemed to occupy all his emotional energy. That would be nice, I said, though we both knew it wouldn't happen. His calendar would be full next month too, just as it had been full for the past 3 years. Great. I'll call you later this week and we'll figure out a date. But he didn't call later that week, or the week after. Instead, I found myself settling into a routine of solitude, punctuated by small, hopeful gestures that went unacknowledged. I sent Michael a card on what would have been his father's 71st birthday, sharing a memory about Robert teaching him to ride a bike in Riverside Park. No response. I left a voicemail telling him that I'd found his old Little League trophy while organizing Robert's office, thinking he might want it for his apartment. He never called back. When I discovered that his favorite restaurant from childhood, Morelli's Pizza on 5th Street, was closing after 40 years, I drove across town to buy a gift certificate, thinking we could share one last meal there together when he visited. The gift certificate sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks before I finally put it in a drawer, with all the other small offerings I'd prepared for a son who seemed to have forgotten I existed. The hardest moment came when I tried to share something that felt genuinely important. I'd been going through Robert's things slowly, carefully, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. In his desk drawer, I found a letter he'd apparently never mailed, a note to Michael written just a few weeks before he died. The letter was vintage Robert, warm, proud, full of the kind of fatherly wisdom he'd always been better at expressing in writing than in person. He wrote about how proud he was of Michael's success, how he hoped his son would remember that accomplishment meant nothing without compassion, how he wanted Michael to take care of me not out of obligation, but out of love. I called Michael immediately, my voice shaking with the emotion of having found this unexpected gift from his father. Michael, I found something I think you'll want to see. Your father wrote you a letter before he died. It's beautiful. He talks about how much he loved you, how proud he was. That's nice, Mom. Can you just mail it to me? Mail it? The casual dismissal felt like a physical blow. This is the last thing your father wrote to you. Don't you want to? I'm sure it's very meaningful, but I'm swamped right now. And honestly, I'd rather remember Dad the way he was when he was healthy. Reading something he wrote when he was sick, I don't think that would help me process things. As if his father's love was data to be analyzed rather than a gift to be treasured. Michael, this letter isn't about being sick. It's about how much he loved you. Mom, I really appreciate you thinking of me, but some people grieve by moving forward, not by dwelling on the past. That's how he characterized his father's final words, as unhealthy nostalgia rather than precious connection. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table holding Robert's letter, feeling like I was the only person left in the world who understood its value. The letter began, "My dear son," and ended, "With all my love, Dad." In between, Robert had poured out his heart about the man he hoped Michael would become. But apparently that hope, that love, that final reaching across the divide between generations was just another inconvenience in Michael's busy schedule. 3 weeks later, I tried one more time. Michael's 38th birthday was approaching, and I spent days planning what used to be a simple family tradition. Robert and I had always made his birthday special, not with expensive gifts he could buy for himself, but with thoughtful gestures that showed we remembered what mattered to him. I baked his favorite cake from scratch, chocolate with peanut butter frosting, the same recipe I'd used for every birthday since he turned 8. I found the candles shaped like numbers that we'd saved from his childhood birthdays, a small ritual that had always made him smile. I even bought the good vanilla ice cream from the expensive market across town, the kind Robert used to splurge on for special occasions. When I called to tell him about the cake, my voice bright with the kind of anticipation that used to mark our family celebrations, Michael's response was swift and brutal in its efficiency. "Mom, that's really sweet, but I'm actually going to Napa with some colleagues this weekend. Business trip, but we're making it a birthday celebration too. Rain check on the cake? A rain check. On his birthday cake. Made by the woman who'd baked one for him every year of his life until he'd moved away, and apparently decided that childhood traditions were no longer worth maintaining. I could wrap it up, I offered, hating the desperation I heard in my own voice. It freezes well. When you get back, don't go to that trouble. Maybe next year we can plan something in advance. But we both knew there wouldn't be a next year plan, just as there hadn't been a plan for the previous 3 years. Michael's birthdays had become something he celebrated with colleagues and business associates, people who could advance his career or enhance his social status. His mother, apparently, no longer qualified for inclusion in such company. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my foolish hope, the cake cooling on the counter, the numbered candles still in their package, the good ice cream melting slowly in the freezer. Robert's empty chair seemed to mock my efforts, reminding me that the man who'd taught Michael about love and family loyalty was no longer here to reinforce those lessons. That night, I ate a piece of the birthday cake alone, trying to remember when my son had stopped seeing my gestures of love as gifts and started viewing them as obligations he had no intention of honoring. The cake was perfect, moist and rich, exactly the way Michael had always loved it, but it tasted like failure. Like all the ways I'd apparently become insufficient for the life he'd chosen to build. Ellen found me the next morning, sitting on the porch with my coffee and the remainder of an untouched birthday cake. "Oh, honey," she said, settling beside me without being invited. "What happened?" I told her about the cake, about the letter, about the gift certificate gathering dust in my drawer. Ellen listened with the patience of someone who'd raised children and understood the particular heartbreak of watching them outgrow not just your home, but your relevance to their happiness. "Some children," she said finally, "forget that love isn't something you graduate from. They think success means leaving behind the people who helped them achieve it." The words rang true, but they didn't make the abandonment hurt less. If anything, they made it worse by confirming what I'd been trying not to acknowledge. Michael hadn't just become busy or distracted. He'd made a conscious choice to exclude me from the life he was building. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. Something that might change how this story ended. Something that would make them understand that a mother's love could be both patient and powerful, gentle and ultimately uncompromising when it came to protecting what mattered most. The days began to blur together in a way that surprised me. Not the sharp, jagged blur of early grief, but something softer and more dangerous. The gentle fade of a heart learning to protect itself by expecting nothing. I stopped baking on Sundays. For 40 years, I'd filled our house with the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls, a tradition that had once brought Michael running to the kitchen with flour-dusted fingers and bright eyes. Now the mixing bowls sat clean and unused in their cabinet, and Sunday mornings stretched quiet and purposeless until afternoon. The phone calls stopped too, though I told myself I was simply giving Michael space to handle his grief in his own way. But the truth was more complicated than that. Each unreturned message had chipped away at something inside me, until the effort of reaching out felt harder than the silence that followed. I'd catch myself starting to dial his number, then setting the phone down. What would I say? That I missed him? That I was worried about how distant he'd become? That his father's death had left me not just widowed, but somehow orphaned from the son I'd thought would always be part of my life? The house itself began to reflect this new reality. Robert's reading glasses remained on the nightstand, but I stopped looking at them with the sharp pang of fresh loss. Michael's childhood bedroom stayed exactly as it was. Baseball trophies on the shelf, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, but I no longer went in there with the hope that he might visit and want to remember who he used to be. Ellen noticed the change first. She'd developed a habit of stopping by most afternoons, usually with some small excuse. Extra tomatoes from her garden, a magazine article she thought I'd enjoy, a new recipe she wanted to try. But really, she came because she understood that grief could be a solitary country, and no one should have to navigate it entirely alone. "You're getting quieter," she observed one Thursday as we sat in my living room, drinking tea from the good china I'd stopped saving for special occasions. "Not sad quiet, something else." I considered her words while watching the steam rise from my cup. Robert had bought this tea set for our 20th anniversary, choosing each delicate piece with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I think I'm learning to live smaller," I said finally. "Smaller how?" "Expecting less, hoping for different things. I traced the gold rim of my teacup with one finger. When you spend months reaching out to someone who never reaches back, eventually you stop lifting your arms. Ellen's expression grew concerned. Margaret, honey, are you talking about Michael? The question hung in the air between us. Until that moment, I'd managed to keep my growing disappointment private, protecting both Michael's reputation and my own pride. But sitting in the living room where he'd opened Christmas presents and blown out birthday candles, I found I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. He called yesterday, I said, my voice carefully neutral. First time in 3 weeks. Asked if I'd received the papers from the insurance company. Just about insurance papers? Nothing else? He mentioned that his work was going well. Some big client he'd landed. Very excited about it. I set down my teacup with the kind of precision that comes from trying not to let emotions show in simple gestures. Then he asked if I'd given any more thought to my housing situation. That's what he called it, my housing situation. Ellen's silence was more eloquent than any words of sympathy could have been. She understood what I was learning to accept, that my son had reduced our relationship to a series of practical problems he needed to solve efficiently. Did you tell him you're not ready to move? I told him I was managing fine in the house his father and I built together. He said that was good, but asked me to keep an open mind about alternatives. The conversation had lasted exactly 7 minutes. I'd watched the kitchen clock the entire time. He was very reasonable about it, very patient with his stubborn old mother who couldn't see the wisdom of his suggestions. That night, I found myself standing in Michael's old bedroom for the first time in weeks. The model airplane he'd built when he was 12 hung motionless in the still air, its wings carefully painted in the navy colors he'd admired at an air show we'd attended together. I remembered how proud he'd been when he finished it, how he'd insisted Robert take pictures of him holding it up to the light. When had that enthusiastic boy become a man who measured love in terms of tax efficiency and estate planning? When had the child who used to call me just to share something funny that had happened at work become someone who contacted me only when there were documents to discuss? I pulled the chain to turn off the bedroom light. But before leaving, I quietly closed the door behind me. Some spaces, I was learning, were too painful to keep open when the people they were meant for no longer wanted to enter them. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the way hope kept trying to resurface despite everything. When the phone rang, my heart would still skip with the possibility that it might be Michael calling just to talk. When I saw a father and son together at the grocery store, I'd still feel that familiar ache of missing what we used to have. But gradually, even that hope began to wear thin. I stopped checking my phone multiple times a day. I stopped composing texts I never sent. I stopped planning conversations we would never have. The change was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it happening. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about calling Michael in over a week. The relief was immediate and guilt-inducing in equal measure. Relief that I'd stopped inflicting constant disappointment on myself. Guilt that I was apparently capable of loving my own child less intensely than I'd thought. Ellen found me crying that afternoon. Not the dramatic tears of early grief, but the quiet weeping of someone who'd discovered an unexpected capacity for emotional self-protection. "What is it, honey?" "I think I'm giving up on him," I whispered. "I think I'm actually giving up on my own son." Ellen sat beside me on the couch, her presence warm and steady. "Or maybe you're just giving up on the version of him you've been hoping would come back." The distinction felt important, though I couldn't quite grasp why. Is that the same thing? I don't think so. Loving someone and accepting who they choose to be, those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to force someone to be who you need them to be. Her words made sense intellectually, but emotionally they felt like permission to abandon the most fundamental relationship of my life. What kind of mother stops fighting for her child's love? What kind of woman accepts that her only son has decided she's no longer worth the effort of maintaining genuine connection? But as the weeks passed, I began to understand what Ellen meant. The constant tension of unrequited hope was exhausting me in ways I hadn't recognized. When I stopped expecting Michael to call, I also stopped being disappointed when he didn't. When I stopped planning gestures of love he wouldn't appreciate, I had more energy for the small daily pleasures that had been getting lost in my larger disappointments. I started reading again, mysteries and biographies that transported me away from my own complicated reality. I began taking evening walks through the neighborhood, noticing changes I'd been too preoccupied to see. The Hendersons had planted a beautiful rose garden. The young couple on Elm Street had painted their shutters a cheerful blue. Life was continuing all around me, and for the first time in months I felt capable of participating in it. The dinner table, which had felt impossibly large and empty since Robert's death, began to seem appropriately sized for one person who was learning to find contentment in solitude. I set it with care each evening: cloth napkin, proper silverware, a small flower from the garden, not because I was expecting company, but because I was beginning to understand that I deserved the same consideration I'd always shown others. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it wasn't despair either. It was something quieter and more sustainable: acceptance. Acceptance that the son I'd raised had become someone I didn't recognize. Acceptance that my marriage had ended and my role as an active mother had apparently ended with it. Acceptance that I would need to build a different kind of life than the one I'd imagined. But late at night, when the house settled into its deepest quiet, I sometimes found myself touching the small wooden box I kept in my bedside drawer, the one that held Robert's wedding ring, and the letter he'd written to Michael and something else, something I hadn't shared with anyone yet. Inside that box was a different kind of truth, one that would eventually matter more than Michael's cold efficiency or my quiet resignation. Something Robert had given me before he died, something he'd made me promise to keep safe until the right moment. It wasn't pain anymore, it was clarity. And clarity, I was learning, could be more powerful than love when it came to understanding what needed to happen next. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that makes you remember why you fell in love with the world in the first place. I found myself spending more time in the garden Robert and I had planted together, not out of obligation to maintain what he'd started, but because something in the rhythm of tending growing things had begun to heal parts of me I hadn't realized were wounded. The daffodils came up first, their bright yellow faces pushing through soil that had looked dead just weeks earlier. Then the tulips Robert had planted in careful rows, red ones that reminded him of his mother's lipstick, pink ones I'd chosen because they looked hopeful. As I knelt among them, pulling weeds and deadheading spent blooms, I began to remember something I'd almost forgotten: who I used to be before grief and disappointment had convinced me I was nothing more than someone to be managed or ignored. I'd been Margaret Henderson long before I became Michael's mother or Robert's wife. At 23, I'd been the woman who'd talked her way into a job at the city planning office when they'd said they weren't hiring women for anything but secretarial work. I'd been the person who'd convinced the city council to approve the first wheelchair-accessible playground in our district, who'd organized the neighborhood watch program that cut break-ins by 60%, who'd learned to change her own oil and balance her own checkbook because she believed in being capable rather than helpless. Somehow, over the decades of caring for others, I'd lost track of that woman. She'd been buried under layers of accommodation and compromise, of making myself smaller to fit the shapes other people needed me to be. But sitting in my garden with dirt under my fingernails and sun on my face, I could feel her stirring back to life. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called the volunteer coordinator at St. Mary's Hospital, where I'd spent 3 years reading to children in the cancer ward before Robert's illness had consumed all my time and energy. "Margaret," Carol's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "We've missed you so much. How are you holding up?" "I'm ready to come back," I said, and was surprised by how true it felt. "If you still have a place for me." "Are you kidding? The kids ask about you constantly." "Tommy Martinez. You remember Tommy? He's been in remission for 6 months now, but he still comes by sometimes just to see if you've returned. That boy credits you with getting him through the worst of his treatment." The idea that I'd mattered to someone, that my presence had made a difference in a child's life when he needed it most, felt like discovering water after walking through a desert. "When can I start?" "How about Thursday afternoon? We've got a new little girl, Emma, who just started chemo. 7 years old, scared out of her mind. She might respond well to you." Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the intervening days remembering what it felt like to prepare for something that mattered, to have a purpose that extended beyond my own 4 walls and my own complicated feelings about family relationships that couldn't be fixed with good intentions. Emma was tiny even for 7, with huge brown eyes and a pink scarf wrapped around her head where her hair used to be. She clutched a worn stuffed elephant and watched me approach her hospital bed with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adults often brought pain disguised as help. "Hi, Emma. I'm Margaret. I heard you might like some stories." She considered this offer seriously. "What kind of stories?" What kind do you like? Stories about brave people. Not princesses waiting to be saved. People who save themselves. Smart girl. I pulled out a collection of folk tales I'd brought. Stories about clever daughters and resourceful sisters, and women who solved problems with wisdom rather than magic. For the next hour, Emma and I traveled to places where intelligence mattered more than beauty, where courage came in many forms, where small people could accomplish great things if they refused to give up. "Will you come back?" she asked as I was preparing to leave. "Every Thursday, if you'd like." I would like that very much. Walking to my car that afternoon, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. The satisfaction of being truly useful to another human being. Not useful in the way Michael seemed to want me to be, compliant, manageable, efficiently processed through the administrative details of my own life, but useful in the way that actually mattered, present, attentive, offering something another person genuinely needed. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Robert's letter to Michael spread open beside me. I'd read it dozens of times since finding it, each reading revealing new layers of a father's love and wisdom. But tonight, I read it differently, not as a gift Michael had rejected, but as a message Robert had intended for someone who would value it. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer able to tell you in person how proud I am of the man you've become. But pride, I've learned, isn't just about accomplishments. It's about character. It's about remembering that success without compassion is just an expensive way to be alone." Robert had always been better with written words than spoken ones, and this letter was his masterpiece. He wrote about values that transcended financial gain, about the importance of staying connected to the people who loved you not because of what you could do for them, but because of who you were when you were most yourself. "Take care of your mother," he'd written toward the end. "Not because it's your obligation, but because she's taken care of everyone else her whole life. And love should be a circle, not a straight line that runs out when it's inconvenient to maintain." But as I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, I realized something had shifted in my understanding. Robert had written this hoping Michael would read it and remember the values he'd been taught. But Michael had made his choice when he dismissed his father's final words as unhealthy dwelling on the past. The letter wasn't rejected anymore. It was reclaimed. It had become evidence not of Michael's callousness, but of Robert's enduring wisdom about what mattered in a life well lived. And I was living proof that his words hadn't been wasted, even if they'd never reached their intended recipient. I opened the small wooden box from my bedside drawer and removed the item I'd been keeping safe for months. Robert's final gift to me, given just days before he died when he'd still been lucid enough to understand what was coming. It was a bank account book, pristine and unused, with my name listed as the sole account holder. Inside the front cover, Robert had written a note in his careful handwriting. "For when you remember who you are, use it to become who you were meant to be. Love always, R." The account contained $50,000, money Robert had somehow saved without my knowledge, accumulated over years of careful planning for a future he wouldn't share but wanted to secure. Not for bills or necessities or the practical concerns Michael kept insisting I should worry about, but for possibilities, for choices, for the kind of freedom that comes when you discover you're not as powerless as you thought. I'd kept this account secret, not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I was still learning what it meant. Robert had seen something in me that I'd lost sight of, a capacity for independence, for making decisions based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. He'd given me the means to remember that I was more than just someone's mother or someone's wife. I was Margaret Henderson, and I'd been managing my own life long before anyone else had opinions about how I should live it. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel that familiar flutter of hope mixed with dread. I answered calmly, curiously, like someone receiving a call from an acquaintance rather than from the child who'd shaped 38 years of her life. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing?" "I'm well, thank you. I've started volunteering again at the Children's Hospital. It feels good to be useful." That's great, Mom. I'm glad you're staying busy." There was something in his tone I couldn't identify, approval mixed with something else. "Actually, I'm calling because I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the house. I've been doing some research, and I found a really nice retirement community about 20 minutes from where you are now. They've got a waiting list, but I think I could get you moved to the top if we act quickly." The casual presumption in his words, that he would research options for my life without consulting me, that he would pull strings to accelerate a decision I'd never agreed to make, might have hurt me months earlier. Now, it simply clarified something I'd been coming to understand. That's thoughtful of you, Michael, but I've decided to stay in the house. Mom, we've talked about this. The upkeep alone will be manageable. I'm managing quite well, actually. There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note, surprise mixed with something that might have been irritation. I just think you're not being realistic about the challenges of aging in place. What happens if you get sick? What if something goes wrong with the house? Then I'll handle it. The same way I handled things before I had a husband and after I had a son who was too busy to visit. The silence that followed was longer this time. When Michael spoke again, his tone was careful, controlled, the voice of someone recalculating his approach to a negotiation that wasn't proceeding as expected. Of course you can handle it. I just want you to know that I'm here if you need anything. But we both knew he wasn't really here, and I was discovering that I didn't really need him to be. The realization wasn't painful anymore. It was liberating. After I hung up, I sat quietly in the growing dusk, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, but something steadier and more reliable. Self-possession. The quiet confidence that comes from remembering you survived before other people's opinions mattered, and you could survive if they stopped mattering again. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. And clarity was teaching me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to stop pretending that broken things can be fixed with patience alone. The first sign that something had shifted came on a Tuesday morning in late April, when I received an unexpected call from a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Walsh from Chicago Legal Services. Mrs. Henderson, I'm calling regarding your late husband's estate. I understand there may have been some irregularities in how the will was executed. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. Irregularities? I'd rather not discuss the details over the phone. Would it be possible for you to come to Chicago this week? Or I could drive down to you, if that's more convenient. The careful professionalism in her voice carried undertones I couldn't identify. Concern, perhaps? Or something more serious? I'm afraid I don't understand. My son Michael has been handling all the estate matters. Everything was settled months ago. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson, that's actually what I'd like to discuss with you. Would Thursday afternoon work for you? My office is downtown, but I could meet you somewhere more comfortable if you prefer. Something in her tone made my chest tighten with an apprehension I couldn't name. Is there something wrong with how the will was handled? I think it would be better if we spoke in person. There are documents I'd like to show you, and frankly, this conversation requires the kind of privacy that telephone calls can't guarantee. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what I'd just heard. Robert's will had been straightforward, everything to me, with provisions for Michael only after my death. Michael had walked me through the paperwork himself, his explanations clear and efficient. What could possibly be irregular about such a simple document? But even as I asked myself the question, I remembered small details that had seemed unimportant at the time. The way Michael had hurried me through some of the signatures, insisting that the legal language was just standard boilerplate I didn't need to read carefully. The way he'd taken the original documents for safekeeping in his Chicago office. The way he'd seemed unusually knowledgeable about estate law for someone whose expertise was supposed to be in finance. Ellen noticed my distraction when she stopped by that evening with homemade cornbread and her usual gentle concern. You seem troubled, honey. What's on your mind? I told her about the lawyer's call, watching her face for the kind of reaction that might tell me whether my growing unease was justified, or just the paranoia of a woman who'd been disappointed too many times. Did she say what kind of irregularities? She wanted to meet in person, said it required privacy. I broke off a piece of cornbread, then set it down without eating. Ellen, what if he's been handling Robert's affairs differently than he told me? The question hung between us like an accusation I wasn't ready to make directly. Ellen had known Michael since he was a boy, had watched him grow from the kind of child who helped elderly neighbors carry groceries to the kind of man who seemed to view emotional connections as inefficiencies to be minimized. What does your intuition tell you? She asked finally. I considered the question while staring out my kitchen window at the garden where Robert and I had dreamed about the life we'd build together. It tells me that I've been naive about more than just my son's capacity for love. Thursday afternoon found me sitting in Patricia Walsh's downtown office, a space that managed to feel both professional and warm. Lots of books, family photos, a window that looked out onto the busy street below. Patricia herself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd learned to deliver difficult news with compassion, but without unnecessary delicacy. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that what I'm about to share with you may be upsetting. I've been practicing estate law for 15 years, and cases like this are among the most difficult I handle." She opened a manila folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across her desk with the careful precision of someone presenting evidence. "3 weeks ago, I was contacted by your late husband's former business partner, David Chen. He was concerned about some financial transactions he'd noticed in your husband's business accounts shortly before his death. I recognized David's name. He and Robert had worked together for over 20 years before David moved to Florida 2 years ago. They'd maintained their friendship despite the distance, talking by phone every few weeks about business, family, life. David had been helping your husband with some investment planning before he passed away. When he tried to follow up on those plans recently, he discovered that significant amounts of money had been moved out of accounts that should have been frozen pending estate settlement. The words seemed to float in the air between us, their meaning clear but somehow impossible to process. Moved by whom? Patricia consulted her notes, though I suspected she knew the information by heart. The transfers were authorized by someone with power of attorney over your husband's financial affairs. That power of attorney was granted to your son Michael approximately 6 months before your husband's death. Power of attorney. I remembered Robert mentioning something about updating his legal documents when his health began declining, but he'd presented it as routine preparation, making sure someone could handle bills and bank deposits if he became too ill to manage such details himself. "The power of attorney should have expired when your husband died," Patricia continued, "but according to bank records, transfers continued for several weeks after his death. Substantial transfers. Money that should have become part of his estate was moved into accounts that your son controlled independently." My hands felt cold despite the warm spring afternoon. "How much money?" Patricia consulted another document. "From what David has been able to determine, approximately $400,000. Money from your husband's business accounts, his personal savings, even the account where he kept emergency funds for your household expenses. $400,000. More money than Robert and I had ever imagined having. More money than I'd known existed in our family's financial picture. Money that should have secured my future for decades, but had apparently been redirected to secure someone else's instead. Is this legal? Can someone with power of attorney do things like this? Absolutely not. Power of attorney expires at death, and using it after that point constitutes fraud. Moreover, even while your husband was alive, Michael's fiduciary duty required him to act in your husband's best interests, not his own. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the earth had shifted on its axis while I was sitting still. All those conversations about my financial situation, all those careful explanations about why I needed to downsize and simplify my life, all those reasonable suggestions about retirement communities I could afford, they'd been based on a fiction Michael had created by stealing money that belonged to me. What can be done about it? Patricia's expression was gentle but determined. With your permission, I'd like to file criminal charges for elder fraud and embezzlement. The evidence is clear, and frankly, cases like this send important messages about the consequences of financial abuse within families. Criminal charges against my own son. The phrase should have shocked me more than it did, but sitting in that office with the evidence spread across the desk, I felt mainly a deep, tired sadness for the boy I'd raised and the man he'd chosen to become. What about the money? Can it be recovered? Most of it, yes. Your son moved it into investment accounts and real estate purchases that can be traced and reversed. He may have thought he was clever, but he left a clear paper trail of his theft. I thought about the house Michael had bought in an expensive Chicago suburb last year, the luxury car he'd been driving, the casual way he'd mentioned taking expensive vacations with business associates. Apparently, Robert's life savings had been funding a lifestyle that Michael had felt entitled to enjoy, while encouraging his widowed mother to consider the financial wisdom of moving into subsidized housing. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something important, Patricia continued. This isn't just about money. What your son did represents a profound betrayal of trust, both legal and moral. People who commit elder fraud often escalate their behavior if they're not held accountable. The drive home took 2 hours, but I barely noticed the time passing. My mind was processing not just the legal facts Patricia had presented, but the emotional implications of discovering that my son had been systematically stealing from his dying father while pretending to help his grieving mother manage her reduced circumstances. How long had he been planning this? Had he seen Robert's illness as an opportunity to be seized, rather than a tragedy to be endured together? Had every conversation about my future been his way of making sure I never discovered how much money was actually missing? By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting behind the house Robert and I had built with honest work and careful savings. But for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about loss or abandonment or the ways love could disappoint you. I was thinking about justice, not the dramatic, vengeful kind that leaves everyone wounded, but the quiet, determined kind that restores balance to a world that had been knocked off its axis by someone who'd forgotten that some things were more valuable than money. That evening, I sat in my living room with Patricia's business card in one hand and my telephone in the other. Through the window, I could see Ellen working in her garden, tending the roses that would bloom beautifully all summer if someone took the time to care for them properly. Some things, I realized, required patience to flourish. Others required immediate action to prevent further damage. The choice was mine to make, and for the first time in months, I felt absolutely clear about which direction my life needed to move. Something was about to change in ways that Michael couldn't anticipate, couldn't control, and couldn't manage with his efficient, reasonable explanations. The storm that had been building quietly for months was finally ready to break. I called Patricia Walsh the next morning and gave her permission to proceed with the criminal charges. My voice was steady as I spoke the words that would change everything between Michael and me forever, but my hands shook as I hung up the phone. 3 days later, Michael called me with a voice I'd never heard before, tight, controlled, barely containing what sounded like panic. "Mom, I need to drive down there today. We need to talk." "About what, Michael?" "You know what about." The careful politeness he usually maintained with me had evaporated completely. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" For 40 years, I'd trained myself to respond to anger with appeasement, to smooth over conflicts before they could escalate into real confrontations. But sitting in my kitchen with the morning light streaming through windows that Robert and I had chosen together, I found I had no interest in making this conversation comfortable for either of us. I'm doing what I should have done months ago. I'm protecting myself from someone who's been stealing from me. Stealing? His voice cracked slightly on the word. "Mom, everything I did was legal. Dad gave me power of attorney specifically so I could manage his finances when he got sick. Power of attorney expires when the person dies, Michael. You continued moving money for weeks after your father's funeral. That's not legal. That's theft." The silence that followed was so long, I wondered if the call had disconnected. When Michael spoke again, his voice carried a desperate edge that might have worried me if I hadn't spent the past week learning exactly how much he'd taken. "You don't understand how complicated Dad's financial situation was. There were debts, obligations, things that needed to be handled immediately or you would have lost everything." "What debts, Michael?" "Your father and I lived carefully. We never spent money we didn't have. Medical bills, Mom. Do you have any idea how much his cancer treatment cost? Even with insurance, there were thousands of dollars in expenses that— I have all the medical bills, Michael. I know exactly what they cost, and I know exactly what insurance covered. The total out-of-pocket expense was less than $8,000. You moved $400,000. Another long silence. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that sounded almost like pleading. "Look, I made some investments with that money. Good investments. I was trying to grow Dad's estate so there would be more for both of us in the long run. Investments in a house for yourself, a car for yourself, vacations for yourself." I kept my voice level, factual, though something inside me wanted to scream at the casual way he spoke about stealing my future. None of those investments were going to benefit me, Michael. That's not true. Everything I did was part of a larger financial strategy that— Stop. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but it had the desired effect. Michael fell silent. "Just stop lying to me. You took money that belonged to me. and you used it to improve your own life while telling me I needed to sell my house because I couldn't afford to maintain it. Mom, listen to me. No, you listen to me. Something inside me had broken loose. Some restraint I'd maintained for so many years that its absence felt like learning to breathe again. For months I've been making excuses for you, telling myself you were grieving, that you were busy, that you'd remember what family meant when you had time to process your father's death. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't interrupt. But you weren't grieving, were you? You were planning. Planning how to take advantage of a sick old man and his trusting wife. Planning how to steal money from the people who loved you most. It wasn't like that. His voice was quieter now, but there was still no genuine remorse in it. Just the frustration of someone whose carefully constructed plans had been discovered before they could be completed. Everything I did for practical reasons. You don't understand how to manage money, Mom. You never have. Dad knew that. That's why he wanted me to handle everything. The condescension in his voice, the easy assumption that I was too simple to understand financial concepts he'd mastered, revealed something that made everything else make terrible sense. This wasn't about grief or opportunity or even greed. This was about the fundamental way Michael saw me, as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose autonomy didn't need to be respected, whose future was his to determine according to his own ideas about what would be best for everyone involved. Your father wanted you to help me, Michael, not steal from me. There's a difference. I was helping you. Do you think I enjoyed having to make all those difficult decisions? Do you think it was easy for me to handle Dad's estate while dealing with my own grief? His ability to frame theft as sacrifice, to present his betrayal as a burden he'd nobly shouldered for my benefit, was so audacious it was almost admirable. Almost. You're right, I said finally. It probably wasn't easy. But you know what else isn't easy? Discovering that your only child has been lying to you for months. Realizing that while you were trusting someone completely, they were systematically destroying that trust for their own benefit. Mom, if you'll just let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Michael. The bank records speak for themselves. The timeline speaks for itself. The fact that you moved money after your father died speaks for itself. I could hear something that sounded like tears in his voice when he spoke again, but I was no longer moved by displays of emotion that came only after he'd been caught. What do you want me to do? I'll pay it back. All of it. We can work out a payment schedule, and you'll never have to worry about money again. What I want, I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in months, is for you to face the consequences of what you've chosen to do. Not because I'm angry, though I am. Not because I want to hurt you, though you've certainly hurt me, but because some actions require accountability, and stealing from your dying father is one of them. The phone was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness I recognized from our recent conversations, but now I understood its source. It wasn't grief or stress or the pressure of managing complicated responsibilities. It was the contempt of someone who'd been caught doing something he'd assumed he was smart enough to get away with. You're making a mistake, Mom. A big one. Do you really want to destroy our relationship over money? The question revealed everything I needed to know about how Michael viewed our situation. In his mind, I was the one destroying our relationship by refusing to accept his theft quietly. I was the one creating problems by insisting on accountability for his actions. I was the one being unreasonable by expecting honesty from my own son. Our relationship was destroyed the moment you decided I was someone you could steal from rather than someone you should love, I said. I'm not destroying anything, Michael. I'm just refusing to pretend that what you did was acceptable. Fine. The single word carried more venom than a paragraph of insults could have managed. Fine. But don't expect me to forgive you for this. Don't expect me to visit or call or pretend we're family when you've chosen money over your own son. And there it was. The final inversion. The last attempt to make me responsible for consequences he'd created entirely through his own choices. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his wrongdoing, Michael was determined to cast himself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than the perpetrator of systematic financial abuse. I'll always love you, I said quietly, but I won't always trust you, and I won't always protect you from the results of your own decisions. I hung up before he could respond. Ellen found me an hour later, sitting on my front porch with tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so profound they felt like a physical release from months of accumulated tension. "How did it go?" she asked, settling beside me on the swing Robert had built. "It's over," I said. "All of it. The pretending, the hoping he'd change, the making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. And how do you feel?" I considered the question while watching the neighborhood children walk home from school, their backpacks bouncing, their voices bright with whatever small dramas had consumed their day. "Free," I said finally. "Sad, but free." That evening, Patricia Walsh called to inform me that Michael had been arrested that afternoon at his Chicago office. The charges were formal now: elder fraud, embezzlement, abuse of financial power of attorney. The legal process would take months, but the money had already been frozen, and most of it would be returned to me within weeks. "How are you handling all this?" Patricia asked. I looked around my living room, at the photographs of happier times, at the furniture Robert and I had chosen together, at the life we'd built that no one could take away from me now, and realized I felt more at peace than I had in months. "I'm handling it just fine," I said, and for the first time in a very long while, I meant it completely. Some truths I'd learned were worth the pain they caused to speak aloud, and some relationships were worth ending if they couldn't survive honesty about who people really were when they thought no one was watching. The storm had finally broken, and in its wake, the air felt clean and full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. 6 months later, I stood in my garden on a September morning, watching the last roses of the season bloom with an intensity that seemed to defy the approaching autumn. They were Robert's favorites, deep red ones that had taken 3 years to establish, but now grew with the kind of confidence that comes from deep roots and patient tending. The house behind me was the same house I'd nearly been convinced to sell, but it felt entirely different now. Not because anything had changed about the structure itself, but because I'd remembered that home isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create through the daily choice to care for what matters. The money had been returned, just as Patricia had promised. $400,000 that had transformed my retirement from a series of anxious calculations into a time of genuine possibility. But more valuable than the financial security was something that couldn't be measured in bank statements: the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself when protection was needed, and strong enough to face difficult truths when comfortable lies were no longer sustainable. Emma, my little friend from the hospital, had finished her chemo treatments in August. I'd been there when she rang the bell that marked the end of her journey through cancer, her voice clear and proud, as she announced to the ward that she was going home to start second grade. Her hair was growing back in soft brown curls, and her laugh had returned to the full-throated joy that serious illness had temporarily muted, but never entirely silenced. "Will you still come read to us?" she'd asked during our last official session together. "Every Thursday," I'd promised. "There are always children who need stories about brave people who save themselves." The volunteer work had expanded beyond the children's ward. I'd begun visiting elderly residents at nursing homes, reading to people who'd lived full lives but found themselves forgotten by families too busy or too distant to remember that love doesn't expire when someone becomes inconvenient to visit. Mrs. Patterson, 93 years old with cloudy eyes and perfect recall for poetry she'd memorized in school 70 years earlier, had become particularly dear to me. She'd never had children, never had the complicated heartbreak of watching someone you'd raised choose cruelty over kindness. But she understood something essential about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone, she'd told me one Thursday afternoon, is just a circumstance. Lonely is what happens when you forget your own value. I'd carried those words home with me, turning them over like prayer beads during the quiet hours when Robert's absence still felt sharp enough to catch my breath. The house was quieter now than it had been in 40 years, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful in the way that comes from no longer waiting for someone else's approval to feel worthy of the space you occupy. The legal proceedings had concluded in July. Michael pled guilty to all charges, avoiding a trial that would have forced both of us to relive his betrayal in public forums designed more for justice than healing. He'd been sentenced to community service and probation, required to make full restitution, and mandated to attend counseling for what the judge had termed profound failures of character and judgment. I'd attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom while my son stood before a judge who'd seen enough cases of elder abuse to speak with authority about the particular cruelty of betraying people whose only mistake was trusting those they loved. Michael had looked older than his 38 years, worn down by months of legal proceedings and the collapse of a life he'd built on money that didn't belong to him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he'd stood silently for almost a full minute before speaking words that carried more truth than any of our recent conversations. I told myself I was protecting my mother from financial decisions she wasn't equipped to make, but the truth is, I was protecting myself from the possibility that she might make different choices than the ones I wanted her to make. He'd paused, looking directly at me for the first time that day. I stole from her not because she needed my help, but because I thought I deserved her money more than she did. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was honesty. And honesty, I'd learned, was more valuable than apologies when it came to understanding how relationships had broken and whether they could be repaired. After the sentencing, Michael had approached me in the courthouse hallway. He looked uncertain, younger somehow, like the boy who used to seek my comfort after nightmares or schoolyard disappointments. "Mom," he'd said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness." "No," I'd agreed. "You don't." He'd nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Do you think, someday, there might be a way for us to have some kind of relationship again?" I'd considered the question while studying the man my son had become, someone capable of systematic betrayal, but also, apparently, capable of recognizing the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. "I don't know," I'd said finally. "I think that depends on who you choose to be going forward, not who you've been in the past. I'm going to try to be better. I hope so. For your sake, not mine. I'm fine as I am." That was the last time we'd spoken. He'd moved back to Chicago after selling the house he'd bought with Robert's money, taken a job with a smaller firm that was willing to hire someone with his legal troubles. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd heard he was attending therapy regularly, that he seemed genuinely committed to understanding how he'd justified treating his parents as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. Whether that commitment would last, whether it would lead to the kind of fundamental character change that might someday make a relationship between us possible again, remained to be seen. But I was no longer waiting to find out. My life had become too full of present joys to spend much time wondering about future possibilities that might never materialize. Ellen and I had taken a trip to Maine in August, staying at a bed and breakfast near the coast where Robert and I had honeymooned 42 years earlier. We'd walked the same beaches, eaten lobster rolls at the same waterfront shack, watched sunsets that painted the sky in colors so beautiful they made you grateful to be alive to witness them. "Do you miss him?" Ellen had asked one evening as we sat on the inn's front porch, listening to waves crash against rocks that had been shaped by centuries of patient erosion. "Every day," I'd answered honestly. "But I don't miss the woman I was when he was dying. I don't miss feeling powerless or dependent or afraid of making decisions without someone else's approval." "What do you miss most?" His laugh, the way he could find humor in almost anything, and his faith in people's basic goodness, even when they disappointed him. I'd paused, thinking about conversations Robert and I had shared about Michael's growing distance, his increasing focus on success at the expense of connection. He would have been heartbroken by what Michael chose to do, but I think he would have been proud of how I chose to respond. The house felt different when I returned from Maine, not smaller or lonelier, but right-sized for the life I was building. I'd started cooking again, real meals with vegetables from the garden and bread from scratch. Not because anyone was expecting dinner, but because the act of nourishing myself had become a form of self-respect I was no longer willing to forgo. The dining room table where Michael had spread his papers that awful morning was now the place where I worked on jigsaw puzzles, wrote letters to old friends, planned volunteer schedules and small adventures. I'd bought new placemats in colors Robert and I had never tried, rearranged furniture to catch better light, hung photographs that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. On quiet evenings, I sometimes pulled out the letter Robert had written to Michael, the one he'd dismissed as unhealthy dwelling on the past. I read it not with sadness anymore, but with gratitude for having been married to a man who understood that love was something you practiced daily, not something you claimed when it was convenient. "Take care of your mother," he'd written, "not because it's your obligation, but because she's taken care of everyone else her whole life, and love should be a circle, not a straight line that runs out when it's inconvenient to maintain." Michael had failed to heed that wisdom. But in protecting myself from his failure, I'd discovered something Robert might not have anticipated. that sometimes the best way to honor someone's love is to love yourself enough to demand the respect they would have wanted you to receive. Emma came to visit one Saturday afternoon, healthy and glowing, her hair fully grown back and her eyes bright with the particular confidence that comes from surviving something you weren't sure you could survive. She brought me a drawing she'd made, a picture of two women sitting in a garden, one older and one younger, both of them reading books. "That's us," she explained. "In your garden, reading stories about brave people." I hung the drawing on my refrigerator, right next to the photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day. Past and present, loss and hope, all of it together in the kitchen where I began each morning with coffee made for one and the quiet satisfaction of a day that belonged entirely to me. The phone still rang sometimes with calls from people who wondered how I was managing on my own. But management, I'd learned, was the wrong word for what I was doing. I wasn't managing my life. I was living it, fully and intentionally, with the kind of attention to joy that had been impossible when I was constantly bracing myself for the next disappointment. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. The silence in my house wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities, peaceful with the knowledge that some storms, when they finally pass, leave the air cleaner and the landscape ready for whatever wants to grow next.